Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our inaugural Humanities Colloquium at Seton Hall. Give yourself a round of applause to get the people in the back to stop talking. Thank you all for being here. Shout out Matt Higgins. It's his birthday today, so we're going to say happy birthday to Matt. Some of you may remember Edgar Valdez of fond memory. Welcome. We're so glad we're doing this on behalf of Mary Balkin and myself, Dean Frierson, the Provost's office, our humanities departments, the School of Theology. Welcome. Welcome especially to our speaker, Roosevelt. We hope this might become an annual tradition, that we could begin the academic career with one another, with our colleagues. As Nancy said earlier this semester, it's not a meeting, it's a party. And really a party in the sense of a celebration of the important work we do and the important work that the liberal arts do at the heart of a university. It's an opportunity, I hope, to practice that original intellectual habit of reflection, the reflection that is prior to and hopefully latent in all our various and hurried activities of teaching and scholarship and reading and sitting on committees. It's hopefully a bit of an opportunity to stop and think, perhaps even to loiter a bit like Socrates outside the house of Agathon. And to midwife our reflection today, we've invited Dr. Roosevelt Montas, Senior Lecturer in American Studies and English at Columbia University. His academic background is in English and comparative literature. He specializes in antebellum American literature and culture with a particular interest in American citizenship. His dissertation, Rethinking America, Abolitionism and the Antebellum Transformation of the Discourse of National Identity, won Columbia University's Bancroft Award, and he was the director of the Columbia Core Curriculum Center from 2008 to 2018. Long-serving and long-suffering, I imagine. He's currently director of the Center for American Studies, the Freedom and Citizenship Program, an academic enrichment program that introduces local high school students to college-level work in the humanities with an emphasis on moral and political philosophy. He's also the author of the recent book, Rescuing Socrates, How the Great Books Changed My Life and Why They Matter for a New Generation, from Princeton last year. I've read the book. It repays its readers. I strongly recommend it. I'm currently rereading it with a number of students at Seton Hall, a few of them here today. And it's worth your time. Roosevelt offers a defense of the liberal arts through the lens of his own autobiography, enlisting the help of Augustine, Plato, Freud, and Gandhi. Now that would be a fun conference panel. The work succeeds, in my humble estimation, in holding a number of things in productive and generative tension: scholarly rigor and personal candor, generosity and criticism, a sensitivity to the contemporary realities of both our society and the academy, but also the essential otherness of great works of human reflection. The book is a reminder of the good of what Alan Jacobs calls table fellowship or breaking bread with the dead. The liberal arts invite us to encounter with what is foreign to us and resists successfully our attempts at facile assimilation. Reading old books is an education in reckoning with otherness. Its hope is to make the other not identical with me, but rather, in a sense, my neighbor. Yet I think, as Roosevelt shows us, in becoming our neighbors in conversation, those same books become occasions for self-transcendence, challenging our assumptions and by turns coaxing and provoking us into greater moral and intellectual depth. The defense of humanistic learning becomes inevitably in the book a defense of the teaching vocation, something that comes out clearly and that I was very kind of touched and moved by. Quoting a colleague, Roosevelt notes, "If the core is not taught well, the core is not taught." And in perhaps my favorite line of the book, although it's very much a first among equals, he writes, quoting Emerson at first, "The true preacher can be known by this. He deals out to the people of his life, a life passed through the fire of thought." And then goes on to comment, "The liberal arts teacher, as it were, casts sparks with his or her own intellectual activity before the student. Some of those sparks land on dry kindling and start a fire that is the student's own." Roosevelt, we're grateful to have you with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gregor, for that really beautiful and generous introduction. I'm really delighted to be here today. Thank you all for finding the time in the hectic first few weeks of the semester to come to this. I love the fact that it's a party and not a meeting, and that's the energy that I feel here. I immediately sat next to a celebrity over there, Edgar, and everybody just came to say hello. Thank you, Greg, for inviting me here too. For this, what I hope turns out to be the inaugural Humanities Colloquium. I have fond memories of coming to Seton Hall. It must have been August of 2006 or 2007. I came for 2 days of workshop to talk about how to teach the kinds of courses that you were then planning for your core, and which bear a strong resemblance to the program in which I was teaching at the time, and which I went on to direct for 10 years at Columbia, the Columbia Core Curriculum. I was here on the first day, I talked about Plato, and then the next 2 days talked about St. Augustine's Confessions and Nietzsche's Genealogy of Moral. I remember being welcomed very warmly and shepherded around by Father Richard Liddy. It's a rare thing to have a core curriculum such as you have. It's an even rarer thing to mount a core curriculum of the type that you did mount. Columbia's core curriculum was put in place in 1919. So it just had its centennial, its 100th anniversary. At the 75th anniversary of the core, there was a big conference, and one notable scholar said something about the core that has become a kind of refrain that is often repeated. But he said that the core was like the interstate highway system, something that we love, depend on, and need, but something which, had it not been built when it was, it could never be built today. In some ways, you proved Arnold Rampersad, who said this, a little bit wrong by building something that is a true core curriculum. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about that endeavor. I know that many of you teach and have taught in the core here, and maybe I'll read some passages from my book too. The passages that I was looking at to read include the line that Greg read. Is that Greg just picked the best parts to quote. No, the whole book is just equally gripping. But what I mean by a true core, a lot of schools have things that are called the core curriculum. But in my view, they don't quite measure up to what a core is. I was thinking when I was my mind thinking about what I might say to this group. There's a clip from a speech by John F. Kennedy that's often played about going to the moon, where he says, we choose to do this, going to the moon, and these other things in this decade is a decade. I don't know, that's a Boston accent or something. In this decade, not because they're easy, but because they're hard. Doing a core curriculum is hard. Sustaining a core curriculum is hard and worth doing, because it is hard. And because it is hard to mount and it's hard to sustain, it is rare, scarce in American higher education. What is this core curriculum that I say is hard to do, that is critical to do, that is worth doing, but that it's hard to do and therefore rare? There are 4 key characteristics of a core curriculum. One is the commonality of intellectual experience. And let me say a word about that characteristic, the commonality of intellectual experience. A core curriculum that establishes a set of works to be presented to all students presupposes an agreement by the faculty, a tentative, revisable, debated agreement, provisional agreement of what texts and intellectual experiences are most worthwhile for each of our students to engage with. And that is hard to achieve. It is hard for us even to have a conversation in which we ask the question, what texts and intellectual experiences do we think are fundamental? Do we think are foundational, elemental, and that we want all of our students to have? It's hard for us to think of that question as faculty because we have been trained in our particular disciplines. We have been trained to be specialists, to be researchers, to talk to people who know the inner details of our discipline and to introduce students to those disciplines. We think about what should a student know in introduction to philosophy, introduction to religion, or introduction to American literature. We rarely have to think about what should a student know just because they're going to college, whether they're going to major in my discipline or not, whether they're going to be engineers or doctors or lawyers or businessmen or anything. What is there such a thing? So commonality of intellectual experience presupposes a discussion, a conversation by the faculty, and a provisional consensus about what these things are. That question, what really matters for a student to know? And let me say that any core curriculum is always provisional. I want to emphasize that. You don't, this is a question that you ask and you propose an answer and you teach it, and then you ask it again and you change and you make tweaks and you propose it again. It always is going to always reflect our ongoing reflection and ongoing engagement with some of the issues that are central to our vision of what we do as faculty members, what the institution does as an institution of higher education, and what our society demands in this moment. I worked some years ago with a school in China, in Hong Kong, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, who was mounting a 1 semester required great text course for its students. And they had the typical discussions that lead to the always tenuous and fragile consensus of what the syllabus is going to be that everybody's going to teach in common. And then the so-called umbrella revolution, I think it was called umbrella revolution, although it hasn't turned out to be a revolution, at least yet. But the first wave of protests in Hong Kong and happened in the middle of the semester. And they switched, in the middle of the semester, the faculty came together and switched one of the texts out to include John Locke's Second Treatise of Government. A response, a rather gutsy response to what was going on in China, in Hong Kong at the time. So a commonality of intellectual experience presupposes that we foreground and commit ourselves to a vision of an educated student that exceeds our own disciplinary commitments, and often that also means our own professional commitments and aspirations. And let me say something about one other thing about commonality of intellectual experience. One of the sacred values in academic life is intellectual freedom, academic freedom, enshrined in our practice of tenure. We kind of have that in our blood. No one will tell me what to teach. The administration, the committee, the curriculum committee cannot tell me what to teach. I will teach. That's a judgment that is reserved, and that is a sign of respect and authority of my own scholarship. So we're reluctant to teach a syllabus that someone else made. We're reluctant to teach a set of works, a sequence, selections that we did not choose out of our own autonomous intellectual activity. And that is one of the big impediments to a faculty coming together and establishing a common course. This sense that you're being encroached on. Let me suggest that one way to look at that is something like a Rousseauian social contract. If you remember in the Rousseauian social contract, the way it's formulated in Rousseau is that I will give up my natural freedoms in exchange for you giving up the exact same freedoms so that we can create a space of contract in which we can make the rules. This is what you do when you do give up some of your academic freedom, when you enter this common project of teaching in a core curriculum, but you do so in concert at the same time as others give up the same degree of academic freedom so that you can together form a kind of social contract, a kind of mutual disarmament agreement, or perhaps a mutual armament agreement. So that's the first characteristic of commonality. And let me just say that what that does for an institution, what it does for the faculty to be teaching and thinking about common texts, the kinds of conversations, the kinds of dialogue, the kinds of collaborations that makes possible across disciplines, across departments, is unique and extraordinary in an academic institution. What it does for the students is also equally unique. The fact that students who might come from different backgrounds with different professional aspirations, different socioeconomic profiles, different ethnicities, different traditions, find themselves in a room reading the same books with others, and in fact find themselves in a whole class reading those same books and having those same discussions. That has a powerful, cohesive impact on the students. The fact that if the program is longstanding, the senior can talk to the first year student about the readings. The alum can talk to the first year student about the reading. It's at Columbia, among Columbia alumni, it's a kind of religion, the core curriculum. Whenever two Columbia College alumni, whether one is 90 and one is 22, find themselves in the same room, it won't be long before they're talking about their Lit Hum or CC or Art Hum experiences, because it's this intellectual and social glue. So it is one way for us to capitalize on the diversity that we value. There isn't a lot of value of having a diverse student body if they are going to self-segregate along affinity lines, if they are going to take the same courses, live in the same dorms, eat in the same places, go out in the same venues. The real value of diversity comes when you get those differences and you get them to mix and talk about fundamental things. So this commonality of intellectual experience, that's the first characteristic of a true core curriculum. It is quite a powerful institutional, social, intellectual phenomenon. The second characteristic of a true core curriculum is that it is organized along small discussion-driven seminars. The point is to grapple with fundamental texts and fundamental ideas as conversation. When I enter into a core classroom, I don't go in there as the expert. I go in there as a guide to an exploration, to a conversation. I teaching in the Columbia Core this semester. I'm teaching the sophomore seminar called Introduction to Contemporary Civilization in the West, a year-long course that begins with Plato. So I've been teaching Plato. I've been teaching the Republic. I don't know any Greek. I'm no expert. I don't have a background in philosophy. I'm not teaching Plato as an expert. I have some expertise beyond my students. The fact that I've read the Republic a bunch of times from teaching it. One, but first time I taught it, I didn't. The fact that I talk to a lot of colleagues, many of whom are philosophers, about the Republic, that gives me some expertise. But the most important thing is that I'm a close reader. And I have the kind of general intellectual tools and skills that I am modeling for the students. One of the absolute requirements of a core curriculum is that the students not only understand your thoughts, but that they see you thinking, that they experience your mind at work. And that's what we do. We read Plato together, we talk together. And the extraordinary thing about the small discussion-driven seminars is this magical thing that we humans are able to do, which is that we can think together. We can think as a group. My own brain has its own limitations. That's its biases, its presuppositions, its assumptions, its preferences, its traumas. This is the way my psyche is constituted. There are blind spots. And my neighbors got the same thing, but they don't quite match mine. They're a little bit different. And we can put our brains together and see things that neither of us can see on our own. And you can take 15 or 20 students and think together, get all the brains thinking together and generating insights and knowledge that could not be attained by any individual and could not be attained by the professor either. So this small discussion-driven classes, it also means that the center, at the center of the activity is the student's experience, and the student's development is at the center of the classroom, not the professor's expertise, not the reproduction of professional expertise, but something that is happening to the student who is a nursing student, to the student who's an engineering student, to the student who's pre-law, to the student who's pre-business, to the student who is a liberal arts major. All of them are in that same room, and their development is the focus. Small discussion based. Now you can begin to see, because small discussion based is going to create another thing that's hard to do. For one thing, it costs a lot of money to have a faculty member teaching a small group of students rather than a lecture. For another, it's not something that most of us have been trained to do well. We have been trained to lecture. And there is a different kind of skill, a different kind of project, this project of leading and guiding a conversation. It is the most highly skilled kind of pedagogy that one has to do. So it puts the focus on pedagogy. You all well know that a seminar is made or broken by the instructor. A skilled, caring instructor can curate an experience that is transformative, that changes the lives of the students and they will never forget. And a careless and unskilled instructor can make that a waste of time and absolutely turn off the student from whatever material we're doing. So that's a different characteristic, small discussion-driven seminars. Third characteristic is the focus on primary texts. And you can call those primary texts different things. Sometimes they're called core texts. Sometimes they're called classics. Sometimes they're called transformative texts. Sometimes they're called canonical texts. But the point is that you are reading texts that are in some way foundational. The ancestor course out of which the Columbia Core Curriculum emerged used to be called, had this lovely innocent name, Colloquium on Importance Books. Colloquium on Important Books. These courses are organized around importance books. Now, important books is always a value judgment, and we discuss and try to refine and revise our idea of what important books are. The focus is not on secondary elaborations, on scholarly interpretation or scholarly debate. We have students reading not what scholars have thought about Plato. We have students reading Plato as one individual reading another individual, as one human being reading the thoughts of another human being. What do we make of this? And the fourth characteristic is interdisciplinarity. That's the common word that we use, interdisciplinary. I like to use two other words to describe this that are not as common, pre-disciplinarity or meta-disciplinarity. These are not disciplinary courses. My disciplinary training is in American literature and culture, pre-Civil War American literature and culture. I'm not there as an expert in that. I'm not there teaching in my discipline. I'm there doing something else. So that pre-disciplinarity or meta-disciplinarity of these courses is the fourth characteristic. So that's what you've done here. And all of those things are hard to do. All of those things are also the lifeblood of the project of liberal education that we claim to be committed to, although so many institutions, it is merely a claim. It is merely a verbal commitment. So anyway, I'm very happy to be back here and seeing what has arisen out of those foundations laid back in the mid-aughts when I was here last meeting with faculty who were getting ready to teach in this program. It's really a rare achievement and of the greatest importance to this institution. I have a quote here that I want to put before you. It's a quote from John Maynard Keynes, a British economist. The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than it's commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. I am sure that the power of vested interest is vastly exaggerated compared to the gradual encroachment of ideas. I put that before you because it's something that I believe, and it's something that I think in some way is it's a premise of this work that we are doing. That there are some ideas that are persistent in human thought, in human society, that permanently assert themselves in human life, and that serious, sustained, rigorous exposure, consideration, reflection on those ideas is among the greatest goods that we can confer to our students. And that's what these programs are about. It is often, I had a teacher who I mentioned in my book named Wallace Gray, who was my literature humanities teacher when I was a freshman. And the way he put it is that the books that we read ask one overwhelming question: what must a person do to lead a complete and happy life? That is the founding question of liberal education. What is the good life? How do we attain it? Another quote I want to put before you. This is from a student I had many years ago, who wrote on his final exam in the Blue Book. He wrote, "Inquiry is fatal to certainty." This is the greatest lesson I learned from CC, that inquiry is fatal to certainty. I said that, and I want to repeat that one requirement for effective teaching of this sort is that your students come in contact not only with your thoughts, but with your mind thinking. And they also need to be engaged with themselves like that too. That is, we're not only interested in their thoughts, but in their minds thinking. And we want them to be interested not only in their thoughts, but in their mind thinking. And this is just a way in which this kind of intensive big ideas oriented teaching can be transformative. Not because it gives you new facts or techniques, but because it subtly and powerfully and pervasively affects the platform on which students build specific bodies of knowledge and professional competencies. You're working on the instrument. I used to have a professor that said that in teaching the humanities, she was not trying to solve the world's problems. She was trying to shape problem-solving minds. So these courses are courses about big ideas and big questions. What does it mean to be human? How do we live with the consciousness of mortality? What's one's duty to one's fellow? How can we create a just and fair society? These are all questions that the text approach and that allow us through them to approach them with freshness. We often have just kind of pat answers to those questions that we appease ourselves with, that prevent us from thinking about them seriously. This is an opportunity to put those pat answers that we have, those assumptions on the table, and examine them freshly. And of course, in the context of this class, we're discussing them with people who often are reading the books for the first time. There is such a pleasure involved in discussing the Republic with somebody who's reading it for the first time. The politics of Aristotle, the Hebrew Bible, etc. The texts are in constant conversation with the present, right? It's not only what did Aristotle say about the happy life, but how does that relate to what we might think about a happy life. How does Aristotle both influence and give us tools with which to answer, or at least think about that question for ourselves? So it's been, 15, 16 years since I was last year. It's been a long 15 or 16 years for all of us. As Gregory said, I wrote this book last year, Rescuing Socrates, How the Great Books Changed My Life and Why They Matter for a New Generation. I spent 10 years as director of the Columbia Core, kind of 10 pretty silent years, write the occasional op-ed and go around speaking. But it was pretty all-consuming job. Didn't have that much scope to write. But I stepped down in 2008 and immediately set to write a book about liberal education that gathered both my experiences as a faculty member teaching. I taught for the whole time as administrator of this mammoth program, but also the way in which my own life had been changed and transformed by my experience of liberal education and of the core curriculum. I'd gone to Columbia as an undergraduate and taken that same core curriculum that I was teaching in and directing. People who reviewed the book found that the book is hard to summarize. If you had to say one thing about it, it's that it is fundamentally a defense of liberal education. It's in explaining how I pursue that defense that things get tricky. Let me say a word about that, and maybe I'll read a passage from the book. The idea of liberal education. Let me say a word about what I take to be liberal education. You probably know that the idea of liberal education goes back to the ancient democracy of Athens, where it was conceived as that education that was appropriate for free citizens. Aristotle described it as an education given not because it is useful or necessary, but because it is noble and suitable for a free person. Now, all Athenian citizens, the sort of free persons Aristotle had in mind, participated in government directly by voting on the adoption of laws, holding political office, deliberating on juries, and serving in the army. The point of liberal education was to prepare citizens for these civic responsibilities. To this day, democracies depend on a citizenry capable of discharging the duties for which a liberal education prepared Athenian citizens. Indeed, the possibility of democracy hinges on the success or failure of liberal education. In the slave democracy of Athens, liberal education was distinguished from the kind of education appropriate for an enslaved person or for a vulgar craftsman. Today, we distinguish liberal education from professional, technical, and vocational education. Liberal education looks to the meaning of a human life beyond the requirements of subsistence. Instead of asking how to make a living, a liberal education asks what living is for. These studies, says Aristotle, are undertaken for their own sake, whereas those relating to work are necessary and for the sake of things other than themselves. This idea of the kind of education that is appropriate for a free citizen, that kind of ancient idea, I think it's worth pondering about, because that ancient conception of a free individual, which I think still applies to, in our society, to the way we think about liberal education, only that whereas before it was for a minority of the population of citizens, in today's society, it is applicable. In today's democratic society, who have universal democracy, it is a universally applicable idea. That is captured in the title of perhaps the greatest single statement about the nature of liberal education, the so-called Red Book, published in 1945 by a Harvard faculty committee. The title of the book is General Education in a Free Society. The general education in a free society and a democratic society is liberal education. But there are three implications in the conception of a free individual from ancient Athens. One is that when the ancients thought about a free person, they thought not just about political freedom in the way that we might think about it today, but also about of economic freedom. A free person is a person who is not enslaved to the requirements of subsistence. That is, liberal education can only take place on the condition of a certain amount of economic freedom. Liberal education is the cultivation of human capacities that come into relevance once the basic requirements of our subsistence are taken care of. If we are going to have a society in which people can actually pursue liberal education, we need to have a society in which people are not driven by economic compulsion. And this is why, even if we are today offering liberal education, so much of our population is driven by economic compulsion that liberal education is like trying to see a candle at noon. It's drowned out. Another implication of that idea of education for a free individual is the idea that this education is supposed to equip you for self-governance. Self-governance at the individual level. Our students, I'm sure that you've seen it, most of our students who fail at college do so not for intellectual reasons, not because they can't handle the complexity or the material demands, but because of failures of self-governance, because of an inability to manage freedom, to manage the competing demands and competing opportunities that come with adulthood, come with independence, come with if you're in a residential environment living in that context. So this kind of education is supposed to equip us to better manage our condition of freedom. Not only is that the main reason why people drop out of college, it's also the main reason why families break up, why marriages fail, why people fail at other careers. It is a pervasive thing in our life. That so many of the deepest afflictions that we face come about from failures of self-governance. This is a kind of education that's supposed to make you better at self-governance. Self-governance is the third implication of that conception of liberal education as appropriate for the free person, which is that self-governance also has a collective dimension. To live in a self-governing society, to be a participating member of an autonomous community that makes decisions, a sovereign community that makes decisions about its own future, there is a certain kind of equipment of intellectual, affective, psychological equipment that you need in order to participate effectively and meaningfully in the project of self-governance. Liberal education is supposed to do that as well. Needless to say, the crisis that we have the political crisis in which we find ourselves in the United States, I would not say that it is directly caused by the failure of liberal education, but I will say that universities have not done their part in liberally educating a population capable of meeting the discursive and social political challenges that we are facing, particularly challenges that have come to the fore in the wake of the new, or facilitated, empowered by the new media environment in which we live. The information environment in which we function makes demands and requirements of the citizenry that we simply have shown ourselves incapable of meeting. And may we regain our bearings. The book is composed of three strands, roughly speaking. One is an autobiographical strand. And that part of the book reads very much like a memoir, where I meditate on my own life, how it has unfolded, and the role that liberal education has played in it. The role that liberal education has played in making me the person that I am, how liberal education has shaped this particular life. And I'll say a word about that in a second. The second strand of the book, of the three, consists of discussion of four authors that had a big impact on me and why their ideas matter. How these writers explore issues and questions that can illuminate the life of any individual. That is, how these writers raise and clarify human dilemmas that every person faces and has to resolve in his or her own life. The four authors, which I'd never conceived as a panel, but what a great panel this would be, are St. Augustine, Plato, Freud, and Gandhi. So each of the chapters of the book is dedicated to one of these thinkers, and I tried both to give a general introduction of some of their salient ideas, why their texts and ideas matter, and to talk quite candidly about how they figured in my own development. The third strand of the book is a sort of a polemical strand. It's a look at the shape and character of American higher education and the place of liberal education in it. I make the basic arguments that the modern American higher education environment is essentially hostile to the practice of liberal education. The kind of practice that transformed my life, and which I argue throughout the book, has the power to transform the lives of individuals today. A kind of education that is especially relevant and important to young people who, like me, come from low-income households, are first generation to go to college, or are broadly come from what we broadly call marginalized communities. Let me say a little bit about the personal, the autobiographical aspect of this book. I'm an immigrant. You can probably hear it in my accent. I'm an immigrant from the Dominican Republic. I came to the United States in 1985 in the early part of a huge wave of immigration from DR. Like many of my fellow immigrants, I was poor. I came with my mom. My mom came a little bit 3 years ahead of my brother and I. My brother was 17 and I was 12 when we came. Of course, we didn't speak English. My mother didn't speak English. My mother had a minimum wage job in a factory. When we came, she lost that job shortly after we came, lived in Queens, went to the local public school, bilingual education. Ended up, till my mother lost her job, we just couldn't pay our rent. She ended up moving to the South Bronx. My brother and I took a room. We're kind of taken in by a distant relative and lived in a basement room in a house in Corona, Queens. In some ways, my story is not at all unusual in my immigrant community. It's kind of typical. I had it rough, but not especially rough among in that community of poor immigrants from the Dominican Republic and other third world countries coming to New York to grind out often a subsistence living for the hope that the children growing up in this society will have better opportunities to make something of their lives than they would have had back home. I got lucky in a lot of different ways, including going to the local high school, which happened to be, those of you in New York City high schools, you often have different high schools within the same building. Now sometimes they're formally different schools, but you had just different tracks. And I ended up in John Bowne High School in Flushing, which might still be the most diverse high school in New York City, which is a big thing to say. And I fell among a group of students who, like me, were immigrants and who took their studies pretty seriously. They were my peers, and in some ways my salvation, because I began to take my studies seriously, to do my homework, to study for tests, to do just the pretty basic requirements. But I was lucky enough to then get into Columbia, and I talk a lot about in the book about what the culture shock. It was comparable to coming from the Dominican Republic, I grew up in a rural mountain town without a TV or a refrigerator or a stove, dirt roads, occasional running water, but not constant running water. I went from that mountain town to JFK. It was, a shock. The shock of going to a dorm room at Columbia as a freshman was similar in abruptness and distance. And I talk a lot in the book about that experience, and how the core curriculum gave me the tools with which to make sense of who I was and what was happening in front of me. Let me say a word about the polemical aspect of the book before I read a passage from the first chapter from the Augustine chapter. This is a Catholic university. And I think you read Augustine in your core, right? So I thought that would be appropriate. Um, you probably know that liberal education is under threat. And one aspect of that threat is obvious. There's pressure. It's kind of comes from the broader culture. Pressure to professionalize the business model of the universities, the practicality of American culture, the kind of ethos of capitalist utility. These are external threats to liberal education. My focus in the book is what I call inside threats. It is a polemic against my fellow faculty and university leaders. So let me state briefly just a few ways in which I see the contemporary university as hostile to the project of liberal education. Well, one way has to do with the structure of the contemporary university, which is organized around departmental pigeonholes, which correspond roughly to academic disciplines. Disciplinarity is the opposite of liberal education. Disciplinary education is one of the contrasted terms to a liberal education, but there is almost no place in the university for non-disciplinary study. That's one of the reasons, as I said before, why it's hard to make a core curriculum in which you're not teaching philosophy or history or literature or sociology. You're teaching everything and from which those disciplines actually emerge. But the university budget lines, tenure lines are organized around these departmental / disciplinary holes, pigeonholes, leaving no room, no curricular lane, no ecosystem in which true liberal education can take place. That dominance of disciplinary specialization also extends to the career. As I'm sure you well know, you advance your career by specialized research, not by general education, not by teaching outside your discipline, not by spending a lot of time cultivating undergraduates. The incentives are misaligned of the university and of the academic profession with the purposes of undergraduate liberal education. And then there are epistemological developments in the humanities themselves, developments that have challenged the very values and views about human nature that undergird the project of liberal education. Notions of human freedom, of virtue, of excellence, of truth, that are presupposed in the very project of liberal education and which have come under epistemological and metaphysical assault in the humanities. You cannot run a liberal or be committed to the vision of a liberal education under that epistemological regime. Okay, let me read a little bit from chapter 1, and then I hope that we can have some conversation, comments, questions, etc. I'm going to read one sort of longish passage, but I'm going to skip some parts. It kind of sticks together as one passage, but it comes from, I'm going to skip around a little bit in the book. As I said, this comes from the first chapter, which is on St. Augustine, the Confession specifically. All of this was fresh with me, as I encountered St. Augustine's Confessions in January of 1992. Confessions is an intensely intimate book, and you always have the sense that you have just walked into a private, whispered conversation. The book invites you to witness a probing, urgent heart-to-heart between Augustine and his God. The subject is Augustine himself, the journey of becoming Augustine. The object of attention is the self. It is Augustine's self-analysis. We probably know more about the psychology and inner life of St. Augustine than of any other ancient person. Before conversion, he was a prominent teacher of rhetoric. So in his self-exploration and in the telling of his life story, he had at his disposal an unsurpassed range of rhetorical tools. His expressive capacity, in particular, his skill at describing emotion and inner experience, is unlike anyone else before modernity. Teaching the book to Columbia first-year students many years later, I found that my transformative first encounter with the text is the exception rather than the rule for the typical 18-year-old. Many students find it hard to establish the sympathetic bonds that must undergird any powerful encounter with a work of literature. This bond is hard to form for students with Augustine, I think, for reasons embedded in our post-Christian and post-modern condition. It's hard in our post-faith world to inhabit the mind of someone who lives with a vivid sense of God's presence. I even find some of my students reluctant to admit it to a sincere longing for truth and to the possibility of truth because it is intellectually unfashionable. Teaching the Confessions in Lit Hum involves facilitating this affective extension for the student, a process that, like all humanities teaching, is partly mysterious and happens more by contagion from one mind to another than by explicit instruction. What makes humanities pedagogy effective is the instructor's capacity to animate what might be alien to the student and evoke from what might at first look like a carcass, a vital and compelling voice. That's why the teacher, in his or her person, is so crucial to the liberal arts classroom. Especially in first-year seminars, the teacher makes or breaks the class. In my early years as director of the Center for the Core Curriculum at Columbia, my associate director, Janine de Novaes, who had herself gone through the core as an undergraduate, rose in a faculty meeting discussing the experience of minority students in the classroom and made a statement that I thought deserved to be engraved and displayed in some prominent place. If the core is not taught well, the core is not taught. Janine's dictum points to the fact that it is not the list of works read in a core course that determines whether a student of color or an international student or a poor student feels excluded or in some way alienated. The decisive factor is the way those texts are taught and the atmosphere that the instructor creates in the classroom. And Janine's point holds true beyond the experience of minority students. Inspired and skilled teaching is a constitutive component of liberal education. It is not an add-on or a perk. Without it, a liberal education simply does not happen. If the core is not taught well, the core is not taught. For good and ill, liberal education is a personality-driven enterprise, and only through an intrinsically personal and in some special way intimate bonds between the teacher and the student can the task be accomplished. The work of liberal education cannot be done without a personal investment in the task. It cannot be done by routine, it cannot be faked, and it cannot be mass-produced. In the Divinity School address, Ralph Waldo Emerson spoke of the role of the preacher in terms directly applicable to the liberal arts professor. The true preacher, he said, can be known by this, that he deals out to the people his life passed through the fire of thought. The liberal arts teacher, as it were, casts sparks with his or her own intellectual activity before the student. Some of these sparks land on dry kindling and start a fire that is the student's own. As a college freshman, my own religious experience gave me an advantage, an entry point into Augustine that others did not have. The power of his mind, the beauty of his language, and the depth of insight that pervades his writing captivated me. In plumbing the depths of his own psyche, Augustine gave me a language with which to approach my own interiority. He gave me a model and a set of questions with which to explore the emotional wilderness, full of doubt and confusion, that was my own coming to adulthood in America, in New York City, at Columbia. Perhaps what most amazed me about the saint was his consciousness of his own heart as a mystery, that its inner recesses were dark, unknown, and often inaccessible. Yet he was relentlessly committed to burrowing deeper and deeper into his own self, and to discovering there, in the end, the only form of truth he would accept. Far from a pedantic or doctrinaire holy man, I found an uncertain, childlike man trying desperately to make sense of his own being in the world. Reading Augustine and other ancients, as I do with undergraduates, is sort of like archaeological exercise. Much of what seems strange and remote has, in fact, a genealogical relation to how we understand the world today. Spending time with these ideas and perspectives deepens our understanding of the contemporary world by revealing how what we think today emerges from and is shaped by discarded foundations. Ancient articles of faith, for instance, like ancient myths, may strike us as simplistic and misguided, at odds with our own perceptions and certainties. Yet they often contain deep human truths, even if clothed in language we no longer understand or grounded on metaphysical assumptions we no longer share. But like the archaeologists, with care and interest, we can recover some of the ancient understandings and use them to enrich and add texture to contemporary knowledge. Such an exercise has the salutary effect of sowing a little doubt in our own certainties, reminding us that we too are historically circumscribed. So with the ancients, as with anyone really, before a dismissal of what seems patently wrong, it is worth asking, in what way are they right? In what way are they right? I had had an innocent childhood in my small town in the foothills of big mountains in the Dominican Republic. My address, recorded in my young memory like an incantation, was Calle 6, Casa 7, the seventh house on the 6th Street. Today, all of the streets have names, and the town has spawned neighborhoods on the edges that are themselves larger than the original grid in which I grew up. Roads were paved at some point when I was very young. I have hazy memories of trucks, gravel, the hot smell of tar, and giant rollers. The big machines that rumbled into the town were by far the most amazing sight any of us kids had ever seen. At some other point in my childhood, we got semi-reliable running water. I remember my father, during some period, often going with a brigade to work on an aqueduct. And one day there was an inauguration ceremony and water was coming out of a faucet in the kitchen. There was one gas station in Cambita, that's where I'm from, which contained the town's one telephone. You would pick it up and wait. Eventually, a lady operator would say something on the other side. Then you told her the number you wanted to call. I was allowed to run everywhere I pleased, and I ran a lot, near naked, along unpaved streets and dusty paths, stealing fruit from neighbors' trees, though never followed by the kinds of pangs that tormented Augustine after an infamous incident with pears. I would venture to the hills for even finer fruity delicacies. At home, there was no television, no stove, no refrigerator, no phone. Sometimes as a shorthand, I simply say that I grew up in the 19th century among people who had grown up in the 18th. There was a lot of violence around, a kind of savage, naked, almost casual violence. People would kill each other with machetes. Teenage lovers would drink poison. Husbands would murder their wives. Kids would drown. Amateur electricians would die electrocuted, their heels bursting open from high voltage. Friends after a night drinking and playing dominoes would be possessed by demonic rage and fight until one killed the other. But this grown-up violence would never reach me directly. It felt real, but always at a distance, like those people you heard about on the radio every Sunday who had won the national lottery. There were also a lot of babies around. My father is one of 12, my mother one of 5. So I had 10,000 first and second cousins of all ages and description. In my own household, from my dad's second marriage, I called it a marriage, but there were never any papers officializing the union. There were 2 babies in the house, my sister Ruth, who was 5 when I left from New York, and my brother Lewis, who was 2. In Fefa's house in New York, there had also been a lot of babies. Dilcia, Fefa's sister, and Secundino's baby, Moises and Luli's 2 babies, cousin Ruth's baby, Noemi's and Chuito's babies, Melciades, Fefa's brother, and Dulce's baby. They lived around the corner. And then my little brother Ray, born in the South Bronx, who was 1 when my brother Casey and I engineered renting an apartment on the street from Fefa's house during my sophomore year of high school. We rented the apartment by teaming up with an acquaintance from Cambita who was living in a rented room nearby. My brother Casey carried the main burden of our share of rent, and I contributed what I had saved from a summer job to the initial rent deposit. Almost immediately, I became very close to Ray, watching and raising him with a sort of desperate attentiveness and kindliness, trying to correct, as I now realize, the deficiencies and cruelties I ascribed to my older brother. So I felt I knew babies pretty well when I encountered Augustine's ruminations, and I knew he was wrong about them, even though so much else in the confessions felt right. Yet Augustine was a teacher of rhetoric, the art of persuasion, Somewhere along the way, I began to suspect that he knew full well what he was up to in his description of infants, and that there was something I wasn't seeing. Could my initial impression of his doctrinaire naivete be right? Or was my quick judgment itself naive? In what way was Augustine right? Anyway, that's it. Thank you. Oh, I took way longer than I had anticipated. Sorry, I lost track of time, that professorial disease. Can we have a little, yeah? Yes.
That was really just captured or any
Thank you.
and I love the way you married and also the fact that it goes against silos that we created. It's sort of business model. It's the liberal nature of it. And I know from a college student, and I remember like when you were talking, I was thinking about what did it feel like to go to college for me. It felt like drinking water, like, like in it when you're thirsty.
Yeah.
And I just loved it so much. And so you really captured that. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a scene in the movie Malcolm X. I don't know if this actually happened in reality, but this scene has always kind of gripped my mind. But Malcolm X is in jail, and he becomes a Muslim in jail, the Nation of Islam. And when he comes out, he's taken to meet Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, for the first time at his mansion in Detroit. And when Malcolm X meets with him, this is the way it's depicted in the movie. Muhammad has a pitcher of water and some glasses on the table, and he takes a pitcher of water and fills it halfway with water. And then he takes an ink stand, an ink well, and pours some ink in the water. And you see kind of the ink spreading and tainting the water. And he says, if the people are thirsty and you give them dirty water, they will drink it. And then he pours another clean glass of water and says, but if you give them a choice, they will drink the pure water. And Malcolm X grabs the glass and drinks it. But you know what? Our students come to college hungry, and they come to college with existential questions that are urgent. They want something more than preparation for a job, even if they have been trained to say that that's what college is for. And they're looking to us to give them something more than that. And we fail them criminally when we don't offer them a real liberal arts education that answers that hunger that they bring in. Yeah. Yeah.
And had the privilege of getting to teach two seminar style classes that discussion oriented format that we talked about earlier. And the results have been exactly as you said. Students have enjoyed them more, and a few have told me personally that the class was transformative.
That's what this is our business, right? That's what we're in here for.
But you're also right that most of our training is lecturing. And it's class caps are usually such that a seminar style class is impossible. I have found that if you have more than 15 students in a class, it's really hard to create that kind of intimacy. I'm wondering what your views are on lecturing. Do you think that lecturing can produce the same kind of transformative experiences or approximate?
That's a great question. I think that there is a role for lecturing, even a role that supports liberal education. I don't think liberal education per se can happen through lectures. I think that liberal education is something that happens from person to person between people, that it requires kind of live dialogue, not just the professor and the student, but among the students. But there is certainly a place for lectures that can support a liberal education. And of course, lots of fields, philosophy, American literature, lots of the disciplines, lectures are extremely useful and valuable. Discussion is a terribly inefficient way of transmitting information.
Yes.
If that's the point, if the point is to tell them all these things about 5th century Athens and the theory of forms and the ins and outs of Plato's arguments, then discussion is not a good way to do that. Discussion is about something else. That's what's liberal, right? It's that open-ended. You don't know what the discussion is going to go. You don't know what the answers are. A discussion question to which you know the answer is never a good discussion question. The only good discussion questions are the ones to which you don't know the answer. So lecturing I think, has a legitimate and important place. But its prevalence in education is not driven by its pedagogical and educational value. It's driven by other, institutional, usually budgetary considerations. Yeah.
I think so much of what you just said depends on what I think is the affective side of the education experience, the emotional side here. And I think if you can engender that emotional side, I think with students, I think in a lecturing sense, you can still accomplish what you hope to accomplish.
Yeah. I mean, I teach a lecture class in American Studies, and you can effectively weave in some, you can ask some questions and set aside 5 or 10 minutes in which actually discussion happens, and so there are ways of kind of blending it in. But what happens is that a few students participate and have something of this experience, and then 90 or 80% of the class just misses out. Yeah.
Hey, thank you very much. Thinking about part of your talk when you mentioned self-governance, and while I would certainly agree that that's an important thing that a great books education can foster. When I think about my students who've failed or been most troubled, I'm not very concerned about self-governance. I'm more concerned with social and institutional failures and injustices that they have to navigate.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd be interested to hear how you think a great books education can those situations, especially when many critics argue that great books educations can't, or that they're complicit in like an unjust status quo.
I think it's quite the contrary. And let me say that indeed many of our students who fail fail because they don't have the resource structure to support them, whether it's at home, in school, in their communities. They are faced with kind of life challenges that, as I said, you need a certain degree of security and stability to be able to do this. And if you don't have that, you're going to fail. A great books curriculum, if it's a common curriculum, the commonality alone has a hugely powerful capacity to nourish and create community. And that's quite a part of whether it's a great books. I mean, you can have a common curriculum based on, say, all contemporary novels. You can read 5 contemporary novels that everybody's reading, and it can have that very powerful community building effect that transcend differences. So a common curriculum is one of the most powerful tools for retention. Like, people who do enrollment management and care about graduation rates and retention and degree to completion. This is a really, really powerful tool to encourage that, to create pathways towards graduation. Doing it with great books, I think, is the most powerful way of doing it, because what makes a book great is its capacity to transcend the historical conditions of its creation. What makes a great book great, take Dante. What makes Dante great is not that he was immersed in Florentine politics and the medieval theology of the Catholic Church. What makes him is his capacity to speak from there to me, a Dominican immigrant in the 21st century who's no longer a believer. Dante can speak to me anyway. What makes Toni Morrison a great writer is not her immersion in the legacy of African-American slavery, but her capacity to make that experience real to a Chinese teenager today. That is their capacity to transcend the conditions of their creation and to make those real in a kind of universal sense. So that's what makes a great book a great book. It's its capacity to connect to the reader at a human level. So they are extraordinarily powerful tools to connect people from different backgrounds. If we give that up, we fall into this tendency to make our curriculum a kind of like a buffet. If you're African American, we'll have some courses for you that are about the African American experience, and if you're Latino, we'll have those. If you are an immigrant, Latino immigrant, we'll have those, and if you're Asian, and if you are gay, and if you are marginalized in some other way, we'll have courses that speak to your specific identity. Those courses can be very powerful and very valuable, and there is a role for them in the curriculum, but it's not the common liberal education experience. That the selection there is a capacity of books to speak across all of those differences. Now, because we live in a Western society, and because we come from a tradition, our language, our clothing, our laws, our institutions come from a particular tradition, I think there is an argument for the centrality of that tradition in our undergraduate curriculum, not for their exclusivity. I don't see any argument for why the grade books curriculum has to be exclusively Western. But I think in a Western institution, it should be significantly centrally focused on that tradition. I mean, there's a lot more to say about this, obviously. Yeah.
To that point, I know most of them are about struggling with institutions.
Yeah.
But my question is, how does Columbia foster that kind of capacity to curate a good discussion? Do you have a systematic process for training each other?
Yeah, probably the most important thing is, so at Columbia, there are 3 categories of teachers in the core. This kind of gets into the weeds, but I'll be brief. There are graduate students who are ABD, so in their dissertation writing stage. About a third of the teachers come from our graduate students that finishing their dissertations. About another third are postdocs who are hired from among the graduate students who kind of excelled as teachers and are kept in the faculty for 3 years, full-time faculty appointments teaching in the core. Those are absolutely the best teachers in the core. That third is kind of the really most excellent and dedicated teachers are in the third, postdocs who care about this and were chosen for that reason. And the other third is regular faculty, tenure track and tenured faculty. Often the tenure and tenure track faculty who have not been trained to this, especially the new ones, are very bad at it. And it's very traumatic, Like sometimes we would have somebody who wrote their PhD in France or something, is a European transatlantic historian or something, and comes to America, first time in America, and throw them in a core class. Very bad, can be very bad. But so we do a lot of training. The graduate students get very, very intensive training on how to run this type of classes, including they take a preceptor, what's called they take a seminar in which they read with a senior professor the books that they're going to be teaching next week and do the seminar. They do the course actually 2 weeks ahead of when they're teaching it. So they get the modeling. We also have every week at Columbia a faculty meeting in which all of the faculty who teach the course come together over lunch and have an expert in the book that's coming up give like a half-hour talk about it, and then a discussion. So those are 2 really important modeling situations in which students, in which instructors learn how to do it. And it's something that you learn, right? But after you've done it a few years, you really do learn how to do it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.